is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to add pagination to your app. So here we open up the app, some data loads in after some time. And if you're not familiar with pagination, it's the concept of being able to scroll to the bottom and it automatically fetches in more data for you. We're going to look at adding the spinner so the user knows that more data is being loaded. It's a lot nicer than, hitting load more at the bottom. A very common paradigm in apps like Instagram, Mail, Facebook, YouTube, basically every decent app nowadays. So that said, make sure you destroy that like button as always. Hit subscribe while you're at it if you haven't done so already. Get excited, get Xcode ready, and let's jump right in. Quick pause before we get into the video. If you haven't seen it already, I am hard at work putting together iOSacademy.io, a community where all of us iOS engineers can come together, learn how to build some of the top apps like Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, in addition to interview prep to land some of these iOS roles at top tech companies. So if you're interested in the free and premium content to come, head on over to iOSacademy.io and enter your email address in the waitlist form, and you will be notified as content becomes available. That said, let's get into the video. All right, so we're going to get started by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. We'll stick with a single view application, and I'm going to go ahead and call this project Pagination. And let's go ahead and save it wherever you'd like. I'll throw it in this folder I've got. And let's jump right in. So first things first, we want to pick a simulator and hit that run button to get that booted up for us. Let me also expand this Xcode window to give ourselves a little more room to work. And let's go to our view controller. So we're not actually going to use an API for this video. We're going to mock some data, but the usage with an API is the exact same. But for the purposes of this video and kind of just saving time, we'll mock some data. So the first thing we want to do is create a table view. So I'm going to do everything in code. So we're going to create a table view like as follows. Let's lowercase that I. And we'll create a table view in here. We'll return the table view. Let's also register a basic cell to it. Whoops. With an identifier of cell. And I'm also going to give it a style of grouped, like so. We want to add this as a subview. Let's go ahead and do that. We also want to assign its data source. So go ahead and do that. And then let's conform to said data source here. Say UI table view data source. We're going to want a collection of data to drive the data source. So we're going to say var data. It'll just be an array of strings. And then we want number of rows. We'll return data.count and cell for row. Cell for row at index path. We're going to say let's cell. We're going to dequeue a cell from this table with our cell ID that we put up above. And then we'll say index path is index path. And because it's an array of strings, we'll say the text labels text is the string at that position. At index path.row. And then finally, go ahead and return the cell. So to actually mock the data, we're going to create another class. Let's create another file for it just to be a little cleaner. We'll do a new file. It'll be a Swift class. And I'm going to go ahead and we can call this API caller. And we're going to create a class in here called API caller. And we'll simply create a function called fetch data, and it'll have a parameter that says pagination. It'll be a Boolean with the default value as false. And again, this is just to mock the data. And we're going to also have a completion handler on here, which is going to return the mock data. And it'll just be returning a results, and the result will return an array of strings if it succeeds, otherwise an error. and then this closure will return void. So in this, just to mock the data that we're waiting for some data to be returned to us, I'm going to add a delay. So we're simply going to say dispatch queue, dispatch, no, we want dispatch queue, global async after, and we're going to simulate a 1 second delay of fetching the data. And we can simply call in here the completion handler with success with some data. And we can say the data is as follows. Let's see, let's give it some random strings in here. So we'll say Apple, Google, what else? Facebook. And let me just go ahead and copy and paste this a few times. I should do it. And what we'll actually also do in here is we'll say this is original data. And it's in success, we're going to say if the pagination block is true, we're going to return new data. If the pagination Boolean rather is true, return new data, otherwise return original data. And then let's create this new data. We'll say new data is also an array of strings, and we can say banana, oranges, grapes, food, and I think that's enough. So we can leave it at that. So let's see what this is complaining. Hit Command B, make sure it's building. Okay, we have an error somewhere. So here it's saying dispatch queue, global, deadline, now +1, execute, escape enclosure. Okay, we should make this escaping, hit Command B, that error goes away. And now what we can do on our view controller is we can create an instance of this API caller by saying private let API caller is an instance of our API caller. And once our view has loaded, and once we also set up a frame for our table view in viewDid layout subviews, let's make this table view take up the entirety of the screen, we can say API caller, API caller dot fetch data, and we get a result in here. Let's switch on that result. In the success case, come on, in what I want is case success. In the success case, we can say self dot data append contents of the new data that we got. Make sure you put weak self here so we don't cause a retention cycle of memory. And then after we've appended the newly fetched data, we can say table view, reload yourself. So we just typed a bunch of code. Let's walk through it really fast. And let's also resolve these errors because that would be useful. View.bounds, this should be .frame, like so. Let's see what this is complaining about in here. We also need a failure case. We don't really care about it for this video, but we need to add it so it stops complaining. And we should get rid of these now. Let's see, switch, expected colon after. Yes, we need a colon here. All right, so let's look at what we just did. So we created this API caller, which would be similar to you getting data from somewhere on the network. And in a 1 second delay, we go ahead and get the data after we call it. Let's actually make this 2. Let's actually be even more mocking-ish about this. So we'll say if we're paginating, make it 3, otherwise make it 2 seconds. And basically we have this new data that gets delivered if we paginate, otherwise this is the original data, and I don't think we need this much data. And in the completion handler for success, we say if you're paginating, if this bool is correct, return new data, otherwise original data. And here, after we set up our table view, we simply create a fetch data call, and we can actually explicitly say false here. And once we call the completion handler, we switch on the result. If it's success, we append the data we get back and reload the table view. And this reload should be on the main thread since it's a UI operation. So if we go ahead and hit Command R now, we should see that we start off with no data, and then after about 2 seconds, we should get data back. So that's definitely, we should have a spinner in the beginning, but for now, we can just ignore that. Now what we want to do is, there's 2 ways to paginate and get more data. One is you could add a cell at the very bottom, and that could say something like load more, or the nicer way to do it, and this is what Instagram and Facebook and basically everybody does now, is once the user has scrolled to the bottom of the table view, it should automatically just fetch more data. So we're gonna do that approach, since A, it's nicer, and B, it's quite frankly just cooler. So I'm actually gonna copy and paste this again, even though I deleted it, because we need more data to show on the screen to get to the bottom. So hit Command R once more, make sure that you have a nice long list of data. All right, so now once we get to the bottom here, we should dispatch a request and get more data. So how do we do that? Well, it turns out a table view, let's actually command click into it. A table view, the way Apple has built it, is nothing more than a fancy scroll view. It actually inherits from UI scroll view. And a scroll view has a function, rather it has a delegate for UI scroll view delegate. And the UI scroll view delegate can basically tell us the position the user has scrolled down, both horizontally and in this case vertically. And from that, we can figure out if we need to fetch more data. So what we're gonna inherit, rather conform to here, is UI scroll view delegate. And we are going to implement the function scroll view did scroll. We're gonna get the position of the scroll by saying the position is scroll view content offset.y. And we are going to basically say if position is greater than the table views content size dot height minus 100, which basically is saying if the user has scrolled to the point where there's only 100 points of room left from the bottom, fetch more data. And let's see if this works. So if we run, let me open up my console, the Command Shift Y, and let me close this left panel. And as we start scrolling, nothing yet. Notice the bar on the right, but we should be getting that print out. Clearly we are not. So let me put a print here and just call it called. Let's try that once more. I think we need to implement, yeah, that's not being called. We need to implement the table views delegate. So we can say here the table views delegate is self. And then up here, let's also conform to the UI table view delegate. Run one more time and let's see if that function is being called. It should be. All right, cool. It's being called now. Let's get rid of this called print so we don't have a million logs down there. And third time's the charm. So we're going to start scrolling. Once we get to about 100 from the bottom, it should call that function, but it's not. So that means our calculation is wrong. So position is scroll view content offset.y. So the issue actually I know that's happening is the offset y actually gives you the position from the top here, whereas here we're getting it from the bottom. So what we should say we also want to subtract the scroll view frame size height. Let's try that one more time. So we get our data and we should get a print right about there. Okay, perfect. So we're about 100 from the bottom. We got a bunch of prints, so we know we need to start paginating. So this actually exposes another flaw in this design, and that is if a pagination request is already occurring, we don't want to fetch more data. But first, before we fix that, let's just say API caller, we want to fetch data. Pagination is true, so we get that new data back. This is going to be result in. We can actually use a trailing closure syntax here because it's the last parameter. And then we can switch on that results in here. And in the success case, we get data back. In the failure case, we're going to pretend like we don't care for this video. And let's call this data something better. We'll call it more data. And we're going to say self.data append contents of more data. And then we want to reload that table view. And we can say self.tableview reload data. And let's do weak self here, like that. Make this optional, make that optional. But like you saw, we had a bunch of print statements down here. So how do we check if a current request is in flight? So what we can do is we can actually, the first time the pagination call is made, we can create a Boolean on here, and we can make it a private var is paginating. It's false by default. And if the user is paginating, we can say if paginating, or if pagination, is paginating becomes true. And once we return, we can say in here, if self.pagination, rather if pagination, then we can say self that is paginating is false. Basically, after the request has returned, this will make sure that we don't have multiple requests in flight. And here, we won't actually start this call. We're gonna, if it's paginating, so we're gonna say API caller, and actually that pagination should be public, so we can reference it here. So you can drop that, it becomes internal. You can say, is paginating. If it decides to autocomplete, there it goes. So if the API caller is not already paginating, continue. Otherwise, we are already fetching more data. So go ahead and hit Command B, clear that out with the Command K, and let's hit run. So we first get our initial batch of data. Then as we start to scroll down, you'll see that we're paginating now. And we have, as you just saw there, more data come in. So there are two things we can improve with this. One thing we can improve is when the app initially boots up, it doesn't show a spinner, which technically it should. We'll ignore that for now. But another thing that we should fix is once you scroll to the bottom, how does a user know it's loading more data? So as I'm sure you've seen in other apps like Facebook or Instagram, they show a spinner at the bottom. So it's a pretty clean way to do that. What you can do is simply add a table footer. So I'm going to create a private function in here, and I'm going to call it create spinner footer. And this is going to return a UI view to us. And we are going to create a footer view with a frame CG rect. So we're going to say the X is 0, Y is 0. Width is the entirety of the current view. I'll say the height is 100. Go ahead and return the footer view. And in here, we are going to add a spinner, which is a UI activity indicator view. And we can say spinner dot start animating. We of course want to make it centered on the footer view. And then we also want to add it as a subview of the footer view. And then in here, if we start paginating, if we start paginating in here, we can basically say self.tableview, table footer view is create spinner footer. Looks like I spelled spinner wrong. Oh well, too late. And once our pagination has finished, whether it's successful or a failure, we can nil out that footer view by saying footer view is nil. So go ahead and hit run. And let's see if we get that spinner at the bottom now. So we first get our first batch of data, get to the bottom. We've got the spinner showing. And then it looks like we get rid of it. We get a bunch of logs here, which is an error because we should call this on the main thread, and it's actually even telling you that right there. So let's stop this and make that adjustment. So we want to call it on the main thread like any UI operation. Let's try that one more time. Get to the bottom, we've got our spinner, it's loading in more data. And then once it's loaded more data, it has gone. So, well, we scroll to the bottom and it keeps loading in more data for the purposes of this video, but let's say you failed to get data, it would just go away. So that's about it. For your actual applications, instead of using this like mock data where we just return data on a delay, you would do something along the lines of making an API call or reading your database if you have a database set up, something like that. So that said, if you haven't destroyed that like button down below already, make sure to do so for the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you're new, if you enjoy these videos. I love making them for you. Hopefully you guys love watching them. Comment down below if you have any errors, questions, comments, concerns. Love hearing from you guys. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.